You're listening to Addressing Gettysburg.
Hello, patrons. Welcome to this episode of Addressing Gettysburg. You may recognize that music. It's a little odd that we start with a song. We don't do that all the time. But I figure this time it would be appropriate, or apropos, as they say. And the reason why is because it's such a great song, but also because it has a lot to do with what we're talking about today. Of course, with me is Bob Steenstra. Hello, Bobby.
Hello, Matthew.
How have you been?
I'm very good. How are you?
Good. You haven't been on recently. We've done a couple of shows, but you were in Pittsburgh.
Right. I haven't been on since the great Halloween ghost hunt that we did. That was
on
fun.
Instagram. Yes.
By the way, folks, that was all BS.
Yeah. There really were no ghost stories. Well, I mean, people did send them in, but the one we told about ours was not really a ghost story. Why? Simply because there's no such thing as ghosts.
Matt, I am very impressed. This is my first time actually doing a podcast in your new studio here.
That's true. Get right up to that mic, Bob.
And
there you
I'm
are.
wondering why the colored lights, since this is just...
Well, we're going to eventually get to video, and it would just make us look like we're not dead.
Oh,
just, color on the face and everything. It just looks nicer. When it's dark outside, it's a lot easier to see what we're doing when the colored lights are on. Yeah, but we've got to rebuild our computer, so it's going to be quite a while before we, come up with the money for that. Anyway, today we're talking about something very interesting, Bob, as you know, because you were invited to this with the name of the title of the subject of the show and stuff, so you know.
I would have come just because John's here.
Well, that's right. John Hoptak is our guest. How you doing today, John?
Doing great, Matt. Thank you. Thank you, Bob. Good to see you.
And you were on probably about a year ago, I think. We're almost a year ago.
I would say so. Probably a little bit more than a year ago.
And we had teased at the end of it that you were going to do a winter lecture about the 54th Massachusetts. And the winter came, and you did. We call that the before time, when
yes.
people were still allowed to congregate and things. And you did one about the 54th, but it was about men in the 54th who were from this area.
Yeah, that's right. We'll talk more about it, of course, but I've had this, a fascination with this regiment going back a long time, and going to some local graveyards, seeing the graves of soldiers who served in the 54th Massachusetts really inspired me to know more about them, who they were.
Yeah.
And digging deep, there were an awful lot of soldiers in that regiment from this part of Pennsylvania.
Yes. And that's what was what I liked about the lecture was that you handed out names of soldiers from the area, and I think there were only 6 left over, right? That you had to double up on like 6 people,
yes,
if I recall.
I always try to make my programs kind of interactive, get the audience involved, and the winter lecture was a challenge because typically the audience is seated the entire time, but I thought maybe it might be a good idea if we could assign everybody in the theater an identity of one of these soldiers from South Central Pennsylvania in the regiment. And the number's escaping me, but I believe there were at least 124 men who were either born in, lived in, or enlisted from this part of the state.
That makes sense, because I think I was listening to the lecture this morning, and which is on our free feed, by the way, ladies and gentlemen, if you want to listen to it yourself. And I think there were 118 people in the room, and you had 6 left over. Yeah. So that would make sense. 124.
Wonderful, yeah. And I think it worked, because throughout the program, I would have on the screen, the theater screen, the names of those who were wounded or killed in action, and I had the audience members stand up kind of to represent that.
So when you said this area, right now, ladies and gentlemen, as you know, we're in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. We're, about 10 miles or so, 11 miles north of the Mason-Dixon line. What are the parameters of this area?
Okay, yes, good question, Bob. Thank you. When I consider South Central Pennsylvania, what I did was I included an area within 45 miles west, north, and east of Gettysburg. I didn't go south of Gettysburg because it was a focus on Pennsylvania men. So anywhere from Gettysburg to about Mercersburg to the west, and Harrisburg to the north, and just about the western edge of Lancaster County to the east, to include Columbia, Pennsylvania.
Did you find any in this 10 miles or so from Mason-Dixon to the south?
To the south?
Littlestown or?
Not really Littlestown. I did find a few soldiers who identified Hanover as either their place of birth or residence at the time of enlistment.
Okay.
So before we get into the details of everything, of course, I'm assuming, but just in case people listening don't know this, the movie Glory is about the 54th Massachusetts, and it's one of my favorite Civil War movies. Yours, would you see it like 120 times or something?
Close to that. Probably in my lifetime, yes. I was just about 11 years old when the movie came out in late 1989, early 1990, and already I was that kid in the town of where I grew up that was the Civil War kid. And my parents took me to see Glory no fewer than 7 times in the theaters when it first came out.
Wow.
So we saw it in just about every theater in Lehigh, Schuylkill, and Berks County, Pennsylvania. We did a different theater each time. But 7 times. It was re-released last year, if you recall, for the 30th anniversary. And I got to see it twice more. So I don't know if anybody's keeping track, but I'd like to think I hold the record for seeing the movie the most in the theater at 9 times. So,
and when it came out on VHS, did you wear out several copies of it?
Yeah, and also the cassette tape of the James Horner soundtrack is
fantastic.
Yes,
I'll sometimes just go for a drive on a nice day like today. If I got nothing to do, I'll just drive around the battlefield and I'll listen to that.
Oh, the movie's the perfect accompaniment for the story.
It really is. Like, it gives you chills. There's that one certain note that the hit in the choir hits that always just gives me a little chill up my spine. It's when they go up high.
But whoever put the soundtrack together, I'm kind of disappointed in that they did not include what I consider to be the best musical track of the entire film. And that was the music that was playing during the march through Boston when they were leaving. You know, it began with the fanfare of the band marching down, across Beacon Hill. And then it just transitions. You know, it goes from this gaiety, this proud military martial music, and then it just moves into this somber, kind of this inevitable music. It's just a wonderful song, and I think the best on the film, but it's not included with the soundtrack.
I think I know what you're talking about. Isn't it? What is that song? Is it Old 1812 or? There's a Civil War song that they blend in over the soundtrack itself. Is that what you're talking about?
What the band was playing, as they were marching.
Yeah. I think it is on the soundtrack. I can't remember the name of it, but I'm looking through it here because I know it's not.
Nope. I only hear it on Glory or on YouTube. Just I type in "Parade from Glory" and
okay. And the scene comes up.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, and the scene comes up. So
I wonder why.
Yeah, I don't know, because in my book that was the best music of that film, and it didn't make the cut for the soundtrack.
That's crazy. It is such a great film, and it is such a great soundtrack. However, for history, it's not exactly what you would recommend someone watch to get an accurate picture of what occurred with the 54th Massachusetts.
Well, of course, with any film, with any history-based film, there's going to be some exaggerations, some inaccuracies, and so on. We see it with Glory or Gettysburg, of course, Gods and Generals, and everything like that. But Glory, of course, was tremendous in that it brought to light a part of Civil War history that up to that point really wasn't discussed or talked about much. And that was the involvement of nearly 180,000 black men fighting for the United States. But there are some things, if you're going to look deep or dive into it, that, just are not historically accurate. When the regiment was formed, for example, the 54th Massachusetts was organized in February and March and April of 1863. The film has it in the fall of 1862. And as Martin Blatt, who is a historian, pointed out, that's kind of doing a disservice to the 54th, because in reality, these men only had a short time to drill, to become soldiers before they marched off to war at the end of May of 1863. Also, there are other things that are more significant. The fact that there's not a single historical figure from the 54th Regiment except for Colonel Shaw, who's depicted in the movie, that kind of has some...
Like, at least Gettysburg had real people, and except for one person.
There was, some criticism that it kind of just painted these generic characters, when there were so many compelling stories that could have been told, whether it be William Carney or the name of the guy from Columbia is escaping me right now. But there are so many compelling figures. Lewis Douglas, Stephen Swain, who fought in the regiment, Swales, who fought in the regiment. There are important stories that could have been told, but they chose only to make Robert Gould Shaw the only historical-based character in the regiment.
Now, Major Forbes is also fictional.
That's right.
But so there is he a composite character, or is he based on anyone, or is he just completely made up?
Well, I would imagine that he was probably just completely made up.
Okay.
Because when we look,
so he didn't have his childhood buddy as his second in command, or
the second in command of the 54th Massachusetts was Edward Hallowell, from a Philadelphia abolitionist family, and he was an officer in the 19th or 20th Massachusetts, just like Shaw was an officer in the 2nd Massachusetts when he was offered command of the unit. The second in command was an officer, I believe, in the 20th Mass. So they knew each other. I mean, they probably had the same social circles. But Hallowell was a much more committed abolitionist than was the real Robert Gould Shaw in real life.
Okay. Shaw, was he, because his parents were abolitionists.
That's right. Yep.
But he was kind of lackadaisical about it and just kind of meh.
Yeah, he was, in some regards, he was more of the Cary Elwes type character.
Like a spoiled brat.
As a youth, at least. But this was something that he evolved into, that he kind of grew into.
Once he got to work around them and see them, and so the thing that I found interesting was, probably most interesting, was that the majority of the men in the 54th were not from Massachusetts.
That's right.
And they weren't former slaves.
That's right. Yes.
How many men total enlistment in the 54th?
When the 54th Massachusetts marched off to war in May of 1863, they did so with 1,044 officers and men. They would add a few hundred more throughout the course of the war in 1864 and 65. But when they were first organized, just over 1,000 men, and only 133 were actually from Massachusetts. So 13% of the regiment. Most of the soldiers were from Pennsylvania in the 54th Mass. So the Keystone State, my native state, could rightly claim the 54th, I suppose, with the number of men from Pennsylvania. Sadly, Pennsylvania was not then organizing a unit of African American soldiers. So those who were hoping to enlist had to make the long journey all the way up to near Boston to join the 54th.
Was that at their own expense?
I would imagine. I mean, unless they were compensated by the regiment. And, we could... One of the things that when you read the newspapers of the era, there seems to have been a member of the 54th who was here in this part of South Central Pennsylvania who was actively seeking out recruits, but they never identified in the newspapers who he was.
The sergeant.
That's right.
Yeah.
It said, a black sergeant from the 54th Massachusetts was in town last week, but I think a lot of these men simply read about it in the newspapers, as one of the men said from Mercersburg, he said, look, we were ready to go. All we were waiting for was, the go-ahead. All the men in our place were ready, he said, and hardly anybody who could carry a musket stayed home. So these men by foot, by rail, made their way up to Massachusetts and joined up with this regiment that was forming. So about 300 men from Pennsylvania. There were, I think, about 150 from New York. in Ohio also, but just about every state in the Union, North and South. And it's another one of the things from the movie, 3 of the 4 major characters, the soldiers, whether it be Silas Tripp or John Rollins or Thomas Searles or Jupiter Schatz, 3 of the 4 were once enslaved, formerly enslaved, which gives...
This episode drops on Monday, November 16th over at patreon.com/addressinggettysburg. Please consider becoming a patron today.